Beautiful. All right. Well, it's 2:03. We can get going. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'm very excited to speak with Alison Taylor, professor at NYU Stern. And we're gonna have a nice time. The chat is open, the Q&A is open, so please chime in wherever you'd like with questions. Where I want to begin, Allison, is you teach a variety of courses at NYU. One of them is called Sustainability for Competitive Advantage. What do you talk about in the first class with your business school students in your Sustainability for Competitive Advantage course?
Yeah, so one thing to say is I probably would name the class sustainability strategy if it was up to me. I spend a lot of time the first few weeks really debating the big picture questions. So I take them through the history of all this stuff, the rise of ESG, what the key debates are. We spend a lot of time on negative externalities. We spend a lot of time exploring the question of what's the problem we're even trying to solve. And I suppose I have a pretty clear view that just because this is an elective, so you've already got students who are interested, doesn't mean you should teach this in a cheerleading way. So I spend a lot of time up front on the critiques. I spend a lot of time trying to help people understand why there's a backlash, to understand what the key arguments are, because I think at this point, students tend to walk in with a very sort of skeptical, borderline nihilistic mindset about this. There's a lot of, even in the people that wanted to take the class, there's a lot of feeling that this is all hopeless and we're not going to get anywhere. And so I have found it best to bring people along with you if you really get those debates on the table up front. And it's not up to me to be like, this is a great idea and everyone must be stupid if you're not doing this, because that doesn't work. So we talk a lot for the first several weeks about the concepts before we get into materiality and strategy. But the class, what I'm doing in the class is putting the students into groups and making them walk through a materiality and strategy process for a real company.
What percentage of your students who are joining because they're amped and they love this and ESG is the way and it's what I want to be doing and thinking about versus, yeah, I don't know about this whole thing. Like let's give Professor Taylor a shot to convince me, but I'm pretty skeptical. I imagine
Uh,
there's a lot of people who are cheerleaders, and if you're skeptical, you're not taking the sustainability
Yeah, I
course.
mean, you'll see the skeptics more in the required classes. So I also teach the required ethics class, and there, yeah, you're gonna have a load of skeptics. I think the mood with the people in the elective is more like, I'm worried about this. I'm worried about climate change. I'd like to be a more ethical leader. I'd like to understand what to do about this. Seems daunting, seems overwhelming, seems like there's a lot of jargon. I'm not convinced. Please convince me. Is I think the mood at the beginning. And then there's a lot of concern about topics like kind of corruption and lobbying, and you tend to get that right on the table up front, which I think is a sign that the students are thinking about these topics in a really sophisticated way.
Yeah, let's talk about skeptics. I want to talk about a famous skeptic. I'm a fan of Prof G. Professor
Oh,
Scott
yeah.
Galloway is an NYU professor of marketing, been there for, I don't know, 20 years or something. He talks a lot on a lot of the podcasts that he's on and stuff about how people teaching business ethics courses is crazy. Like, why are we teaching a bunch of, over testosterone 27-year-old males about ethics? That's just not a relevant course. Um,
Well, I
what do
would
you say
say a
to
couple of
that?
things to that. One is I don't think it's all testosterone fueled 27-year-olds anymore. There's just as many women, and they tend to kind of skew a bit older. I think even like in the 20th century, and Stern was the first business school or one of the first business schools to have a required class in ethics, but I think historically there's been the kind of here's how you stay out of jail, and that's something that you got to teach people. Like, I don't think you walk in understanding what the compliance department's for, what the HR department's for, how you handle yourself. But I would have the view that if you don't understand these debates and you're like, yeah, shareholder value, that's it. Like, as a leader at this point, like leaving aside the kind of current political climate, there's a physical reality and things are moving in a certain direction. And I would argue you at least need to understand the concepts behind the sustainability debate. Same with inclusion, if you want to be a good leader. So I'm not saying everyone's got to go and have a job in ESG reporting for the rest of their lives. I'm just saying understand what this topic's about, understand what materiality is, understand the relationship with strategy, understand the key debates. Fine, go and work in finance or marketing or strategy or whatever you're interested in, but have this as a minor. Have this as a topic that you've got some confidence in.
Which professors, or not by name, but maybe which departments do you think most value the lessons learned in your courses, and which don't build on it as much as you think they should?
I mean, I think sort of within Stern and in a lot of business schools, there's a debate. Yeah, I mean, the really famous skeptic about ESG beyond Galloway is Ashwath Damodaran,
Hmm. Hmm.
valuation professor. So a lot of the finance department will say that this is all nonsense and there's no business case. I think if we're talking though about leadership, management, organizations, that kind of department, then there is a relationship to strategy. So I sort of think this mirrors the real world. Like you can be having a pretty abstract debate about the markets and does ESG drive alpha, and there's a lot of counter evidence there. But if you're still running a company, you're still existing in the real world with young employees and climate risk and like physical reality. We're still in physical reality at the moment, the last time I checked, at least. I mean, you're in Aspen, but maybe you're not. But you know what I mean? Like, so there's still a real world and there's still perception shifts and there's still a shift to intangible value. And we can critique ESG metrics, and I do as much as we like, but this is all an exercise in trying to capture something that, in my opinion, is real. So to sort of say, well, it's not real because we can't relate it to alpha is just not the way I see the world.
Do you think the goal then of somebody like yourself or somebody listening to this who's mostly in the corporate sustainability role, is it to convince Prof G and Oswald Damodaran and their versions in the corporate world that there's value to the work we do, or is it to say you can't win everyone over? Let's keep doing good work in the way we see it and work with the people who appreciate
Yeah,
it, and then eventually 20 years from now, the next generation of finance leaders will think differently.
I think it's a bit of both. And I think, a point I would really stress in the course is like, this is still a really immature field. Like, we're still, grasping around trying to get this right. We haven't really settled the debate. So I would also try to challenge conventional wisdom and say it's not necessarily you need to solve every challenge. Let's be really strategic. Let's focus on materiality. Let's think about what you've got leverage over and what you haven't, what you can control. Let's think about the difference between this and mainstream corporate strategy. Like, what are we even saying? Environmental, social, governance factors, what kind of challenge do they present? What should we do about them? So let's start at that level and not CSRD. Let's start really big picture and conceptual and understand why there's a debate. You don't have to agree with me, but I think most students will be like, well, climate change is real. The difficult question is what we do about it.
Yeah. You brought up CSRD and regulation, so I want to go there. I embarrassingly forgot the copy I have of your book that I wrote up and posted it up and had all these quotes underlined. And it's at home, and I don't have it with me, which is annoying for me. But nevertheless, you wrote this book, Higher Ground, that came out recently, and you sort of start off with the premise that for a long time, ethics meant following the law. So
Right.
that's what a corporate ethics department did, is like, oh, great, let's follow laws and make sure we're not following laws. It'd be a problem if we weren't, and that's good enough. And perhaps now that's not good enough anymore, maybe because laws don't always do what they need to do, or maybe because there could
True.
be really strong strategic alpha driven reasons to do things that are not required by law. So what do you think is uh, the positives of a company's relationship with the law as written today? And where do you think companies shouldn't necessarily, or should do more than just follow the law? Like where's what's so good? How would you describe the relationship right now between the law and corporations?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question. I think the first thing we can say up front about how corporations treat this whole topic is they tend to have a separate department called ethics and compliance and then a different department called sustainability. So, in corporations' minds, not that they've really got a mind, but there's a distinction between the voluntary stuff you do and the required stuff you do. And that's interesting in itself because if we're looking at sustainability as a big picture topic, it's a mix of regulated and unregulated. It's a mix of thinking about where the law's going to go and thinking about, you just expressed it beautifully, like where you need to go beyond the law. So I would say the upside of the law is when there is a law, you'll get budget and you'll get attention and you'll get people and lawyers will take it seriously. The downside is when something's a law, you'll get budget, you'll get attention, you'll get lawyers, and people will take it seriously. So you'll start to get very procedural. You'll start to get someone that's very worried about getting sued. You'll start to
Hmm.
get a lot more kind of oversight of what you're doing. And so I think we're seeing the upside and the downside of this on reporting right now. Reporting is becoming more regulated. So a lot of the time it's now being taken away from the sustainability team and given to either the CFO's department or the ethics and compliance team. That's going to mean more seriousness and rigor and more budget and more attention. It's also going to limit the scope of creativity and going to, I think, increase this tendency we've got at the moment to treat this as a tick box compliance exercise. So, pros and cons, it's harder to treat something as strategic once other people in the organization have concluded this is basically a compliance exercise. So I think the
Yeah.
problem we have in sustainability, right, is that the issues we face are a mix of impacts, risks, opportunities, and sometimes regulatory imperatives layered on top of that. And so you tend to get this very kind of blunt approach where corporations are treating the issue in one of these ways when is in fact it's a range of challenges. And I think that's the difficulty of integration, really.
Yeah, when there's a law, when there's a bar to jump over, you jump over the bar, and you don't have to go much higher. Like a high jump, if you ever watch pole vaulters in the Olympics, somehow by some miracle they're always exactly 1 inch over the bar. They're never
Exactly.
3 feet over the bar because they can be. They're barely over it, and that's the same thing that happens with laws. Like, oh well,
Exactly.
finally we have a standard. Let's be 1 inch above it, and why be 3 feet above? Why do a lot more? Well, you got to be careful. Like, why all of a sudden
Or
you got
let's
challenges?
break the law because the cost of getting caught or the fine
Yeah,
we have to pay, it's less money than the gain we make from breaking the law. Like I think a lot of companies are making that calculation, especially tech companies, on privacy and questions like that.
yeah. If you're queen of the world here, do you think, and you could solve all these problems with a wave of a wand? Do you think the um what you're trying to accomplish with ESG and what you think companies could accomplish with ESG would be better solved with more regulation, less regulation, or maybe just differently structured regulation?
I mean, I think one of the problems we've got, right, is that most of the issues we're talking about are giant collective action problems. So if you had perfectly coordinated, consistent laws in every country in the world, that'd be really nice. But, the whole reason we've got this problem in the first place was that business globalized, businesses went somewhere else where the law either didn't exist or wasn't properly enforced, and they did that for competitive advantage. That's why we've got ESG, is to counter that gap in the law. So it would be, I mean, and then you've got the problem of different companies have different material issues. So you've always got the kind of challenge of over regulation and, restricting companies from doing strategic things. So I think well designed, like a global carbon price would be amazing. That would make a far, far, far greater difference than all the voluntary reporting exercises in the world. How likely is that to happen? Last time I checked this morning before I got on this call, not very likely. Everything looks like a total mess. So we can critique ESG all we like. It's shooting fish in a barrel. It's the easiest thing. I do it every day, but it's unfortunately about the best we got at the moment.
Tell me about something you brought up critiques a bunch of times. Did you start your class with critiques of ESG? You said it's really important not to come in as a pure cheerleader, a doe-eyed cheerleader who doesn't know the negatives. Steelman the opposing argument. Like, what are the biggest critiques of
Uh,
ESG, especially about how companies have been doing it the last couple of years?
Not reduced to a single numerical score, not even reducible to a set of numerical scores. Lots of things that are very, very important are impossible to quantify. Things like values, even risk is difficult to quantify. You've got the problem with how ESG metrics are designed. So I don't know if you saw that OECD study, but two-thirds of them are just what the company's doing, no relationship to the actual outcome, and only 2% are context-based. So there's only a certain amount you can do if the government in question is running it coal-fired power plants. You can have renewable energy, but if it's still based on that, there's a limit to what you can do on your scope 3 emissions. So there's a whole question, I think, about the kind of external political, environmental, regulatory context and how well these numbers even factor that in. So we can think of this as a highly imperfect way to respond to changes in the environment. I would like to see a lot more rigor around the politics and around the regulatory environment on this topic in general. And then, I mean, I think we've just kind of got a question of breadth versus depth. So, are we expecting companies to just focus on a few things where they can really move the needle? We don't seem to agree. In fact, anytime a company makes a claim to be doing one thing well, we start yelling at them because they're doing another 38 things badly. So we're not sure if we're trying to drive strategic advantage on what a company can achieve or raise the floor for everybody. We're not sure if what we're doing is a branding exercise or a compliance exercise or a strategy exercise. We've got the whole, I mean, I could go on and on. We've got the whole question of what does the chief sustainability officer do? Who do they report to? What department do they sit in? Should this look different in different sectors? We've got the greenwashing, over promising problems. We've got the fact, a whole debate about what you can really expect a for-profit corporation to do about any of these topics. We've got the fact that negative externalities aren't properly valued, and accounting doesn't really work in this context. We've got leadership problems, lots of problems. There's a lot of problems.
You've convinced me. I think I'm gonna quit.
Give up, right? Let's just give up.
That's I had this post yesterday, the day before on LinkedIn, where I was basically saying like this is true. My one of my parents' best friends, very successful. Known him since I was a baby. Very kind. Not a big climate change guy. Just like loves sending me YouTube videos and various blog posts about how temperatures are not really rising or they are rising, but
Right.
the New York Times is a bunch of people who doesn't know what they're talking about. You've seen the type. And we were hanging out a week ago or two at my parents' house, and he was reminding me about all these exact issues that you kind of just brought up. And I'm like, you know what? Like, they're all true. Like, you can't say they're not true. But
Right.
I think what's cool about this particular community is you say, all right, great, they're true. Let's solve them. Like,
Yeah, exactly. I think,
let's take them
what I
down one by
say
one.
to my students is you can spend your life working on this topic. It's just starting out. It's still the Wild West. Like the thinking's so immature. So that's an opportunity because it's a
Yeah.
super, super interesting. Like how corporations fit in society in general is really evolving. Like I do think it makes a difference how well you manage and think about these issues. Like I do think it's strategic. I do think it's fascinating. So there's a lot of opportunity to shape this world going forward, and its imperfections are just part of that opportunity.
When I started in this industry about 5 years ago, every sustainability person reported into marketing, communications, HR. Over the last couple of years, they all moved into finance and legal. And for the most
Right.
part, the narrative has been that is a good thing. That is where the money is. That is where serious subjects are. That is
Yeah.
where you're taken in some ways more seriously. You have to provide more numbers. Do you think there's also cons to that? I mean, a lot of the work you do is around communications of this stuff, and you even just said like this could be like how does the company present itself? What are values? Those are in some ways more marketing issues than they are legal issues. What are the cons of having everyone's excited to move out of marketing because there's no more fluff. We're not just gonna like buy
Right.
offsets to claim carbon neutrality on our can. And I'm like, that's a good thing. I'm glad we're not just claiming carbon neutrality on a can. But what are the cons of having moved away
Yeah.
from the
So
storytelling side of things?
super interesting. Like I generally think it's good that reporting moves under the CFO or compliance, and I think the CFO is better ideally if it's the CFO that gets it. But there's an interesting trend where let's take Unilever as an example, and Unilever is definitely a leader, still a leader. They had a combined sustainability and corporate affairs role a little while ago, then they separated them out. They've just recombined them. And I think so. I think it's now, and I would say corporate affairs over marketing, but I think, and so you'd need an advanced set of thoughts on corporate affairs. But I think if sustainability starts to get truly integrated into operations, into procurement, into buying and selling, then there's an argument to recombine sustainability and corporate affairs because it is about how you communicate what you're doing and how you get clarity in this world where, I mean, we're so polarized and there's so much misinformation that I think there's genuinely an incredibly pressing challenge with how you communicate what you're doing. So it's both having sustainability and communications very close is both a sign of immaturity and of maturity. So it really depends what
So
business is
what would
doing.
you
It can be
do?
a sign you're doing nothing but communicating. It can also be a sign you've actually got these concepts properly embedded, and so you can refocus on the communicating. Just really depends.
So if it does depend on like if you were CEO of some, mid-market company that's been doing this stuff for a couple of years, they've measured emissions, they've got the reports down, they get assurance, let's talk mostly about environmental sustainability and less the social
Yeah.
stuff maybe. But where would you put your sustainability team? Communications, finance, legal, a couple in
Uh,
each? Like what would you do?
I mean, if it's manufacturing or something, I'd probably put it in operations. Like, it depends what the supply chain looks like. I mean, if it's a company that's mainly procuring raw materials, I might have it in procurement, in supply chain somewhere. Otherwise, I'd probably have it in operations or risk. If the company is more mature, I'd have it in strategy. I mean, I think in my dream, the chief sustainability officer and the chief strategy officer are the same person. And we're not really thinking in terms of strategy over here and we have sustainability as a bolt-on. We're considering those concepts in a very, very closely connected way. But I mean, the other thing to say here is that it's going to really depend by industry.
Yeah. There's a question here from Terry, so I want to bring it up. But Terry asks if there's been any talk of trying to incentivize reducing carbon footprints in alignment with regulations in regions like the UK. For example, reduce your scope 3 emissions by X% and get an X% reduction in tax liability. I've heard a little bit of this of like maybe there'll be a carbon tax, and there's emissions trading schemes, which are sort of like that. You might have seen stories about
Yeah.
Tesla, where like a huge proportion of Tesla's revenue is not in car sales, it's carbon credits that they get from California and sell to
Right.
other companies. So there have been versions of that, right? What have you seen, Alison?
Not really my area. I mean, sounds like a really good idea. I thought the question was going to be about company level incentives and ESG bonuses. I mean, anything structural like that, I think would be a great idea for people listening that haven't heard it. There's a really interesting podcast recorded at COP with the CEO of ExxonMobil. It's just interesting to hear an oil CEO talk about carbon regulation, and he's in favor of quite a lot of it. He was pretty clear about what would and wouldn't work in his view. And, maybe we do or don't want to be listening to ExxonMobil, but I think the guy is pretty clear headed about what he is and isn't going to do in response to these various forces. And made a case for thoughtful regulation from the perspective of just predictability apart from anything else. So if we've got the CEO of Exxon saying that, then maybe there's some momentum out there over the long term. I don't know. Again, when I woke up this morning, things didn't look amazing.
Yeah. For what it's worth, I'm very team talking to Exxon. People are like, "Oh, cut the oil." Like I was just at a
Yeah, me too.
Reuters Responsible Business event in New York. It was the key like platinum sponsor was Shell,
Yeah.
and it was a bit of the joke of the conference. I'm like, "All right, of course we're at a climate conference sponsored by Shell," but you know what? Like Shell's I'm glad they're in the room. Yeah, I'm glad that they're in the room instead of not in the room.
Yeah, I think I think we need them in the room. I think we need them to be honest and realistic about what they are and aren't going to do. I don't think yelling at them has got us very far. If it were up to me, I'd ban them from advertising or marketing or sponsoring anything. So that's and I have good friends at Shell. I think they're in many
Like
ways very,
cigarettes.
very,
Yeah.
very, yeah.
Uh,
But that's not happening. I mean, I certainly think there is impactful work to be done with the quote unquote dirty industries.
100%. You brought up a topic I wanted to touch on, which is uh, I think the way you phrased it is that, once a company gets good at one thing, instead of congratulating them for being good at one thing, we yell at them for not being good at these eight other
Right.
things. And I think that's the most outrageous, like we're shooting ourselves in the foot as
Yeah.
possible. I'll tell you a personal story. Um, one of the companies we work with at Beehive is a large software company that does stuff related to hiring. And they have a huge and very successful program helping formerly incarcerated people get jobs, doing trainings for them, helping them with background checks, helping introduce them to potential
Right.
employers. Like, incredibly impactful program. I don't know how many thousands of formerly incarcerated people have gotten jobs who wouldn't have otherwise, like
Right.
super aligned to what they do in
Right.
HR and
Yeah.
employment.
Highly material, highly
Highly material.
justifiable. Yeah.
And they're concerned that they're not doing enough on climate. And
Yeah.
I told them it just doesn't matter. Like, what are you
Totally
going to do?
agree.
A bad job on climate that takes away from the great job somewhere else
Not as
instead of just,
material. They can cut their staff travel, the rest of it scope three. I mean, classic. I mean, very often, if a firm was like that was focused on climate, and I think it's true of many software providers are talking about climate at the expense of their core business model. I would think that's not a firm, what you've said to me is a highly strategic materiality based program, which is exactly what this firm should be doing. And perfect example. I mean, the example I have is Patagonia. The founder of Patagonia hands over ownership of Patagonia to nature, and it takes 2 hours, and then it's in the mainstream media. People are like, that's just tax avoidance. That's still plastic, and they haven't given employees any ownership stake, and like blah blah blah. So even if you're Patagonia, I mean, I think everyone else that's not convinced looks at that example and is like, well, clearly these people aren't going to stop criticizing me, so I guess I'll stop
uh,
trying to please them. This is not
yeah,
helping. It's really,
yeah,
I get it. I really get it. I get the hypocrisy. I get the greenwashing. But if someone is doing their best to try and be strategic and to try and move the needle on something highly material, then we need to give them a bit more leeway, I think. We need to give
yeah.
companies a bit more leeway to put their highly imperfect efforts in front of us and reward the good ones and critique the bad ones. But there's a lot of good effort out there.
Yeah, Patagonia actually, I just finished. So the CEO is Yves Chenard, and he wrote a book maybe 15 years ago, and I just finished it last week. And even 15 or 20 years ago when this book came out, he had a chapter in there, all the stuff that they do for nature, all the advocacy that they do, all the like they try to support tearing down dams so that rivers can go back to their natural flow, or supporting local tribes who are going to take care of the whatever. They do all this work and they get criticized for not doing enough on other topics. And even
Right.
15 years ago, he wrote a whole chapter about the philosophy of everything we do is for nature. We think if we can keep nature pure, it'll
Yeah.
solve a lot of other issues around
Yeah.
employment and economic justice. And this is just our view, and we're going to lean into nature. Even 15 years ago, he had to justify. I'd stop yelling at me for not doing enough around whatever other issue. We're the nature company. We do the nature stuff.
What
And
they're
that
doing.
still
And
hasn't
you
gone
know that
away.
about them. They've managed to be tied to that. And there are a few other companies that have pulled that off. And I feel like a lot of companies are still stuck because of this breadth versus depth problem, trying to say, well, we're doing this and we're doing a great job on this as well and on this as well. And the reality is no one, the average stakeholder is not concentrating at the level where like, well, that's a good job, that's a bad job. It just all sounds like everyone's making the same claims. So
Yeah.
it's not helping your differentiation, and no one's going to stop yelling at you anyway.
Yeah, you got to be differentiated. You got to be specific to your strengths. You should
Right.
follow the law everywhere. So if there's a law that says you should measure emissions or whatever, yeah, go ahead, measure emissions, like follow the law. But if you are not a like energy company or a manufacturing company, like I am less impressed by your carbon neutrality than I would be if whatever your strength is, you did a ton more around that strength.
Exactly.
Uh,
Well, your
yeah,
hiring company example's perfect. Or I love
yeah,
Chobani. Chobani focuses on the US agricultural food system. Great.
as well they should. Yeah.
Well, as well it should. Many, many very difficult issues in that system. Perfect. That's a strategy.
Yeah, and you can't be too broad. You also brought up very early on in our conversation here, making the business case. And when we talked a couple of days ago, you talked about how you've been seeing this, folks in our industry love to self-flagellate a little bit and say, here's all the things we did wrong. Here's everything that was
Right.
so terrible. And you said that a few times now in the last few months, you've heard this refrain of, oh, the things we did wrong is we talked too much about morality in the last couple of
Right.
years and not enough about the business case. And you're saying in a similar way that I see, like, that's bullshit. Like, you can't
Yeah.
go
It's
back
not what
and
I
pretend like
saw.
all we've been doing is like I've been it just in my perspective, I've been in sales in this industry for a long time. I promise you, I was not winning deals based on morality. Like
No, no.
I wasn't winning. Yeah, it was just a business case.
Every panel I've seen for the last decade has been like, we're not doing this to save the polar bears. We're doing this because there's a business case. Or it might be like, hey, there's an amazing business case, and guess what? It's the right thing to do as well. But everybody was leading with the business case. So to say that the problem is that we were just emphasizing polar bears and bunnies and birds at the expense of the business case, I'm not in the rooms I was in. The problem
Yeah,
was
maybe
maybe we oversold
unfortunately.
the business case. Maybe we made the business case when it wasn't there. Maybe we weren't sufficiently differentiated and nuanced. But to say that we weren't making it at all, I don't think so.
Maybe unfortunately, we should have probably had more polar bear ads. We can't forget about the polar bears.
Oh,
But
no,
talk
yeah.
about everyone's forgotten. But talk about the business case when look, a lot of people on this call here are corporate sustainability people. Many of them are now reporting to the CFO. And when they go to the CFO and they say, I need $100,000 for blank, the answer is great. Why and what am I getting out of it? And however else you frame it, that's some sort of business case. In what situations is this business case done properly? Maybe a specific example of like, yeah, here's an example of where it was done really, really well. I'll actually give you one to get it going that I really like. And then where, like you say, like we're overdoing it. Like there's not an amazing business case for, I don't know, carbon neutrality or whatever in certain
Right.
cases. They're really expensive. And I'll give you one example that I really like of a business case. Twilio is a really cool company. They basically do APIs for communications, publicly traded company and they're I think her title is chief sustainability officer, but she's awesome. And what she basically did was say we can only be successful if we make money the way the rest of the company makes money. So
Right.
sustainability is not going to be a thing we also do over here. It is
Right.
going to be an extension of our core product. So for Twilio, the way they make money is anytime a message gets sent, they make a quarter of a penny. So she goes, how can I send more messages related to sustainability? So she and her team went out to a bunch of like disaster response nonprofits and said, hey, when the internet's bad because there's been some terrible earthquake in Haiti or like an earthquake in California or tsunami in Japan or a hurricane in Haiti, and you're on the ground and you're trying to like get in touch with each other, use Twilio's products. We'll give you a huge discount on them, and you'll be able to communicate better, and people's lives will be saved, and you'll be able to respond faster. And she gets all the money she wants from her CEO because every time she gets a dollar, she returns a dollar 50, which is less than what her peers inside the company get. You give them a dollar, they return three, but it's still returning money like
Right.
in the same way. So I love that example of a business case that's going very,
That's a
very
good
well.
specific. I mean, the more specific, the better. So I think the business case that doesn't work is like that broad reputational. Stakeholders will love you. Like
That's the
balance,
one that doesn't
write
work.
a nice report, and you'll have an amazing reputation, and that will be upside, and people will be more motivated. Like that's the questionable thing. Like this is always makes money. It's always a win-win, but you just described something super specific. I think the other thing, so there's a tool out of the Center for Sustainable Business at Stern called ROSI, Return on Sustainability Investment. A key premise of that is simply very often that companies aren't measuring, they aren't looking. It's not that there isn't the business case, they're just not looking and measuring the specific thing. So, not very common, for example, to measure the full cost of turnover. You measure the cost of the settlement, the actual kind of payment that you make. You don't measure the cost of collapsing morale, more voluntary turnover, the fact that everyone's looking for another job the whole time and not putting in their all anymore. Like there's a lot of costs people aren't measuring. Car companies crazily don't measure the full cost of recalls. So there's lots and lots and lots of examples like that where it's not that there isn't the business case, but no one's gathering that specific data. And so I think what we're both kind of saying in different ways is you got to be super specific. Like you've got to go and say, we're going to test this initiative and this is going to be the upside and this is how we're going to measure it. And hey, CFO, we're going to try this. You can't be like, just do an ESG report and it's all going to be a win-win. That's the difference between a good business case and a bad business case.
Yeah, I know a company, a fairly large private company, who published a yearly report, and the person who led the charge on all that stuff texted me and a couple of other people in the issue world, and she goes, "Hey, can you go to this website, click this button, download the report?" And she didn't say this in the text, but I know exactly why she did that is because she wants to go to her boss and say, "I got
Oh, the
11
download.
views, or 25 views, or 38
Right.
views, or 300 views, whatever it is," and I did it. But my if that's how you're earning your keep,
Yeah.
by asking your friends to click the button,
Engagement score.
maybe you're gonna get there to whatever number is impressive to you and your boss, but that can't be right.
No,
Like, it can't be
no.
that me, who really doesn't care, did you a solid and click the button.
No, exactly. That's when we're desperate. That's when we're treating this as a form of marketing. That's
And
when we're
that's
saying
where,
we engage 25 stakeholders on our
yeah,
152,000 words is the average
yeah,
ESG
yeah.
report now.
And it used to be real. Like, I know companies. I talked to this head of investor relations at this large financial company, and she was saying that in 2021 or two, they had no ESG program, but she was doing IR there. And I think she said like 20% of calls investors asked about some sort of sustainability or
Right,
social metric. And so she spun up the ESG program. That was a real, like, stakeholders engaging, important stakeholders who
right.
are material, who hold the dollars. It wasn't like your interns asking, which it matters, but matters less than your investors asking. That number has gone way down. And last year, she said it maybe like 2% of calls brought up
Mm.
an ESG topic. All of a sudden, like, you got to weigh, is it worth keeping? How do I convince my CFO to keep it?
Right.
Do I convince my CFO by saying it'll come back? Or do I
But
convince them
then
by
we're
saying,
just we're just rising and falling based on these kind of trends. So I think all this sort of yeah, did investors know what they were doing in the first place? So there's a difference between informed and less informed investors and what they were asking about in the first place and whether they were asking for a single score and so on. But, I think, yeah, we need better metrics than engagement and questions at on the earnings call.
yeah. Someone in the Q&A just asked how often was risk raised, which, if you want to provide a little more context, that'd be helpful. My guess is that that is like, how often do investors bring up risk? And if you can frame your ESG work in the context of risk management, that makes a lot of sense. But again, I think you need to be really specific. Like, for example, um, when you talk about uh, some work in sustainability around carbon offsets, for example, and you say the reason we're going to buy carbon offsets is to like reduce the risk of reputational hazards by not being
Right.
carbon neutral. Yeah, it's a little tricky, like, how much are you
You better be
reducing
good
this?
offsets, and
Better
that's
be
not
good
a
offsets,
given.
which is another reputational risk. Or like, who's
Right.
gonna buy your product more? Who's gonna work for you more often? Like, oh, young people like this. Here's a stat from Deloitte that says young people like this. I'm like,
Yeah,
oh,
exactly.
that's
Exactly.
tricky. When you talk about what we do, which is physical climate risk in large part, it's like, we can tell you, the quantity of days of work lost because hurricanes have impacted your workforce in these specific geographies where you have
Exactly.
employees. Like, that's a number. It's like, you've lost 300 work days. Like, here's the number. Do with that what you will. So I think you got to be specific around risk.
Right. And great example of how, like, yes, it's becoming less of a kind of, marketing upside to talk about this stuff. But I think if you're a B2B firm, if you're sourcing food, you haven't decided that you suddenly stop caring about this because we're in some anti-woke era. Like, this is
Hmm.
like the physical reality still exists. The same stuff's still happening to your coffee beans and your sugar and your flowers and all the rest of it. So, there is this sort of absurd debate about what, has this all gone away? Has this trend over? Well, no, not if we're still living in the real world, which we just about are, maybe.
Not if it's material, exactly. Like, one of the, when we talk about what we're doing here, the basic, like even the investor pitch, I literally walk through like climate risk is not a new issue. It's not a hot button issue. It's existed since forever, but only in certain industries, in agriculture,
Right.
in insurance, in real estate, in utilities. Disaster risk has been very, very material since, since the day those industries were born hundreds of years ago. What's changing now is because of a combination of laws, and these disasters are getting more frequent and larger, and like awareness around them is growing, is that more companies are both like they are reaching materiality more because the disasters are larger and companies are
Yeah.
more spread out, but also like the awareness on there is higher, but not for everybody. I think if we
Depends
say,
on your business model. It depends what you're exposed to. And again, like if
yeah,
we're just advising people to pay attention to things where they're not seriously exposed, then it's not going to work. And I would rather, like, I'd rather see it to your tech example, rather see a pharmaceutical company focused on access and affordability than I would on climate change. I just,
yeah,
and not to say we're not in a climate crisis, but we've all seen that data about how it's a tiny handful of companies causing this in the first place. Most of them are state owned, actually. Like we need to have a better conversation.
yeah. In our last couple minutes here, by the way, folks, feel free to ask questions, but I want to talk a little bit about careers
Mm-hmm.
inside of companies.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of your students graduate and their dream is to get some sort of sustainability job inside of a company. And let's start there for younger people entering this industry. And then later we'll talk about more mature people who have been doing this for a while. But where do you point them in their job search to be in places where they're going to be best positioned to do meaningful and interesting work? Or maybe where do you point them
So
away from?
I say, I say just be prepared to have a decade of experimentation. I say be very skeptical about a sustainability team role. You don't, there are great sustainability team roles, but don't make that the be all and end all. Everybody needs this as a minor. Like you can go and work in marketing, finance, strategy. I said this earlier, but understand this topic, like, and then be prepared to be flexible. Don't have set ideas about what you will and won't do. So I spend a lot of time saying maybe get power first. You can go and work at Goldman Sachs and then like kind of pivot to this world later. So I think we need to give better advice than you've got to go and get an ESG analyst role or your life's over. So I say it's a no brainer that you need to understand this topic. It is a no brainer that you need to be able to advise a company on these topics, but that's not necessarily the same thing as saying you need a job in this precise field. So, totally fine to try a lot of different things. And I have a lot of different speakers with different career paths in to sort of illustrate this point to them live.
Yeah, I like your line of go get power first.
Yeah, exactly. Go and get
Be-
power.
Because then if you have power, be it over money or operations or supply chain decisions or
Exactly.
whatever, you can make the more sustainable choices, whatever they are. But if you are trying to shove it in to a department that doesn't
Exactly.
care, then you're not going to get very far.
And I think, people disagree with me about this. There's certainly some really strong technical skill sets that are needed in many dimensions of sustainability, but it's just as, if not more important, that you can navigate the business and you're credible in the business, you understand the politics, you've got some track record outside sustainability, you've actually driven these ideas. So I think we just need to be careful about saying there's only one path forward.
Yeah. Let's go one stage up then. Let's say you've been in a career here for call it 10 years. You're still relatively young. You're maybe mid-level. But you're nervous. You're nervous because you've seen a lot of your peers get let go. You're nervous because
Yeah.
you have a new boss and your old boss cared and your new boss doesn't, or your stock's down a little bit and you're not sure if you're going to get the resources you want. How do you advise individuals like that advocate for maybe first define what it is they should want out of that job, and second, advocate for it?
Yeah, I think I would always advise anybody go and get an adjacent skill set, buttress yourself with as many adjacent skill sets as you can. Like understand communications really deeply, understand, so many sustainability people have not studied risk deeply, enterprise risk really deeply, or thought about this stuff. Go and work in procurement for a little while, go in the field, make sure you travel. So I think you've got to, again, like focus on broadening your skill set. So you're just not just sustainability. You don't want to be seen in that way. You don't want to be pigeonholed. And I would think about where your organization has the most traction and either go and study finance or risk or something else that will give you that kind of extra buttress, extra credibility. I mean, governance, risk, compliance, kind of corporate governance, those sorts of topics. Go and study accounting. Like, I wouldn't do it, but I can see the argument if you're interested.
You've said a few times in this conversation, you said, in your dream world, the chief strategy officer is the chief sustainability officer. You've said this version of go and get these other skills and work in those departments and bring your sustainability minor there. If you were fast forwarding 10, 20 years, do you think the sustainability role still exists and it's pushing it is there to do these things, or do you think it's been brought into every department and the legal department handles sustainability reporting and the supply chain department
Yeah.
handles cleaner procurement and whatever else?
I don't know. I mean, I could certainly see that argument. I wrote an article in HBR a few years ago with Bob Eccles where we argued that ultimately you should be trying to get rid of your job. So that would be a very, very mature business. And the analogy, of course, is tech. We used to have like chief digital officers, and we don't, but we've still got often a CTO, even though tech's embedded into every business. So I still think you still need someone looking over the horizon. I think you still need someone understanding where the world and society is going. Are we calling that sustainability in 20 years? Not necessarily, but there's something about that skill set of looking out into society and understanding and interpreting the forces that are going to affect your business that maybe it's as simple as saying we're going to shift to a more context-based view of sustainability, of strategy rather. And that will by definition include sustainability. So I'm okay if that happens. I'm not okay if this is an excuse to just get rid of the limited amount of effort we've made so far.
Yeah, it might be too early. We gotta wait a little
Right.
bit.
Let's not celebrate yet.
Yeah. And let's graduate to you're more senior. You're a VP. You're a chief sustainability officer. You're later in your career. Uh, you're seeing what's going on. You still have executive support. You still have board support because you're been around for this and you're good at these skills and you know what you're doing here.
Yeah.
I want to talk about what that person should be doing right now. Companies have really shut up
Um,
for the last 6 months, and maybe
right.
it's to keep safe and not put a bullseye on their back. Maybe it's because they're afraid. Maybe it's because the ones where it's not material shouldn't talk about it, and the ones where it is material shouldn't talk about it. But if you are this senior executive here, and you do have power, and you do have your board and your CEO support, what are what are you advising them to do or not do right now?
I'm advising people to have a sort of CEO task force to think about strategic, ethical, social, environmental issues. So what I want to see is some kind of function where you've got government relations, risk, HR, ethics and compliance, sustainability and strategy together, making sure that you've got joined up messaging of really thought about all the scenarios, of being really careful what you're reporting and actually have a plan for when the pendulum starts swinging the other way. So I'm really focused on all those internal governance mechanisms. That's not just about like, is the sustainability function keeping its job? It's like, are we really managing across the business? Do we have joined up efforts? Are we really focused on a few things we can actually solve and trying to get the structures in place to make sure we've got our ducks in a row?
Amazing. Allison, this has been great. I really appreciate the time. Everyone here should follow Allison on LinkedIn. She's an awesome writer, posts every day pretty much, and I learned something from it. So I appreciate the time, and I hope everyone has a lovely 4th of July.
Yeah. Happy 4th of July, everybody. Thanks so much for a great conversation and be in touch. Take lots of
Thank you,
care.
Allison.
Bye.
Bye.